Thanks, Brenda. Thanks for that great introduction. It's great to be with you once again for another incredible program we have for our audience today. I miss seeing you in person, of course, but I'm glad we can try to do our best to provide a virtual program for our audience all over the world. To our attendees, it's truly my pleasure to give you a really warm welcome to the Ready Conference, and it's my privilege to serve as your moderator for the plenary session for this year. It's a time-honored Ready tradition to kick off the technical portion of the conference with the plenary session. This is where all attendees from all of the different tracks come together for the one time during the conference. We present a topic that we believe connects to all of our participants. Now, in the past, this focused, of course, on drugs and devices. And now that we expanded the program to add a biologics track, it was our ambitious challenge to choose a topic of interest to all three medical product centers. It's actually a lot of fun to select the topic for the plenary. Now, over the years, we've covered a wide range of topics, including combination products, rare disease treatments, and for those of you who remember last year, we addressed real-world evidence. In reflecting on the past year, there couldn't be a more fitting topic than FDA's public health response to the COVID-19 pandemic. What a year this was for all of us around the world, and certainly for the FDA. Our panelists for this session really need no introduction. It is truly an honor to welcome the three center directors leading the charge for drugs, devices, and biologics. Dr. Patrizia Cavazzoni, Director of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, or CDER, Dr. Peter Marks, Director of the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, or CBER, and Dr. Jeff Shuren, Director of the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, or CDRH. We'll start off with a presentation from our esteemed panelists, and then come back with an interactive roundtable discussion with you. Dr. Shuren will get things started for us today. Again, thanks for joining us at Ready 2021 and this year's plenary session titled Leading FDA's Emergency Response to the COVID-19 Pandemic. Take it away, Jeff.
Thank you, Elias. I'll begin with CDRH's response to the pandemic, followed by Drs. Patrizia Cavazzoni and Peter Marks to discuss CDER's and CBER's actions, respectively. So let's begin with the steps taken by CDRH. When the Secretary of Health and Human Services declared a public health emergency on January 31st, 2020, the FDA was able to take advantage of its Emergency Use Authorization, or EUA authority. Under that authority, the agency can grant emergency use authorization to medical products necessary to address the public health emergency because there's no adequate, approved, or available alternative. And under this authority, it can authorize medical products under a lower standard than it otherwise could that balances between assuring that those products are still safe and effective, but can expedite patient and consumer access to those products. In the case of CDRH, medical devices are really the tip of the spear. They become incredibly important at the beginning and throughout a public health emergency, like personal protective equipment. And CDRH took advantage of that EUA authority and participated in extensive engagement with product developers to help bring to market scores of medical devices. We also took active steps to mitigate supply chain shortages. So in calendar year 2020, you can see in blue the number of pre-market submissions we received for non-COVID indications, and that was over 17,000. But then on top of it, we received almost 5,700 requests for emergency use authorization, or what we call a pre-emergency use authorization, which is an opportunity for a medical device developer to engage with our experts to get their questions answered in real or near real time, to problem solve, and to submit data on a rolling basis. And you can see that we received almost 5,700 EUA or pre-EUA requests in calendar year 2020 alone, and that continued throughout 2021. So result of leveraging our EUA authorities or reviewing products under our traditional pathways like 510K, CDRH has authorized over 1,400 medical devices so far to address COVID-19. In the case of tests, in the first week of June 2021, we had already authorized over 380 different kinds of tests. That included molecular diagnostics, antigen and antibody tests that can be used in a variety of settings, such as laboratories, point of care, including physician offices, as well as at home. We also authorized a variety of other medical devices, such as personal protective equipment, ventilators, respiratory assist devices. We also issued several guidance documents that provided flexible policies to allow other kinds of medical devices needed for COVID-19 to come to market more expeditiously, as well as to allow a variety of kinds of devices that had already received full marketing authorization to make certain kinds of modifications without the need for prior FDA review, particularly in the case of building in capabilities to provide treatment or diagnosis remotely, because we knew that patients and consumers would have a difficult time seeing their healthcare professionals in a hospital, clinic, or other healthcare facility setting. We also participated in extensive engagement with developers. Beyond pre-EUAs, we created a variety of email boxes to receive questions, information, and data from developers. And so far, we've received almost 400,000 inquiries. We also, for a period of time, established a 1-800 24/7 hotline in which anybody could call with a question regarding a medical device pertaining to COVID-19, and we would get them an answer. From the beginning of March 2020, we've held a weekly webinar for test developers to answer their questions and provide updates. And we've also held webinars and town halls for a variety of other technology developers. We put out our recommendations on how to validate tests and other kinds of medical devices in what we call EUA templates to facilitate developers being able to evaluate their technologies to make sure that they met the EUA standard, that they were safe and effective, as well as to make it easier to submit data to the FDA. When we got questions that were asked repeatedly, we put up frequently asked questions on our website and their answers, and then we updated those as new information became available. Viral mutations have been a great concern for us. Since the beginning of March of 2020, we've been monitoring databases to look for new mutations to the SARS-CoV-2 virus to assess whether or not they might cause, either alone or in combination with other mutations, adverse impact on the performance of one or more tests out on the marketplace. In February of 2021, we put out guidance making recommendations to product developers on steps that they should be taking to both monitor for the impact of new mutations, as well as to develop their tests in ways that can reduce the likelihood that any one or more mutations could adversely affect their performance. And when we identify that there might be a problem with the test, we put that information up on. We've also been actively involved in addressing and preventing shortages of medical devices, and that has included tests, test supplies, ventilators, respirators, and other personal protective equipment. And we have seen challenges in the supply chain at various locations. What you can see on the slide is some of our experiences with respirators. You can see over the course of the pandemic at various times, we've had issues with the availability of raw materials, sometimes with manufacturing, particularly when we're dealing with facilities in other countries, countries that may have, in effect, nationalized our facilities to then use those products for their own populations or put in place export restrictions, making it more difficult to get supply into the U.S. There have also been challenges in the distribution chain for products to be shipped over to the U.S. And of course, increases in demand by end users, products being used for non-traditional purposes, and institutions or others creating their own stockpiles, putting a strain on the supply chain. In response, we've taken a variety of steps. One of the challenges we faced at CDRH at the beginning of the pandemic is that we had no explicit authority to require that information about pending or actual shortages be reported to the FDA as regards medical devices. And as a result, we had a cold call over 1,000 manufacturing facilities across 12. Unfortunately, because there was no requirement to report, we received responses in, on average, only 1/3 of cases, and oftentimes the information we received was incomplete. And that made it more difficult for the U.S. to be well prepared and to be able to take appropriate actions to mitigate or prevent those shortages. We ended up having to repurpose about 130 of our FTEs full or part-time to engage in shortages work. We address shortages or potential shortages through increasing product supply using our emergency use authorization authorities for a variety of policies that allowed for the use of viable alternatives. We even served as a clearinghouse for laboratories that may themselves have validated the use of alternative test supplies, and if they were willing to share that data with us and it looked good, we would put that information up on our website so that other laboratories could take advantage. We work collaboratively with other parts of government like the Department of Defense and HHS on expanding the industrial base. We even participated in facilitating an airlift of swabs out of Europe to the U.S. Here's an example of actions we took in the case of respirators, just to give you a flavor. Early on, when we were dealing with shortages, we, along with CDC, put out recommendations on conservation strategies, what products might be able to use as alternatives to best meet the needs when there was an insufficient supply of respirators. We then identified alternatives. We expanded supply through emergency use authorization, and that included for products coming from other countries that did not go through the traditional NIOSH approval process. And then we granted emergency use authorization for decontamination systems as an action of last resort to provide the ability to use a respirator more than once if properly decontaminated. But as the supply increased, we then took steps to revoke those emergency use authorizations for the decontamination systems, as well as for respirators made in other countries and authorized in other countries, but not having gone through the NIOSH approval process, because there was no longer a need for those products or the use of those decontamination systems. We've also taken a variety of actions in the post-market setting to protect. Continue to require that adverse events and malfunctions be reported to the FDA. We've continued to monitor for problems. We've also required post-market studies. When we've identified safety problems, we've communicated them in safety communications. When there have been violations of FDA requirements, we've quickly reached out to developers to have those violations stopped, such as inappropriate claims or inappropriate marketing. And when needed, we've issued warning letters. Also, when new information may become available that products should no longer be or authorized, we've revoked EUAs. We've also put up import alerts and stop admission for shipments of products at our borders. We've also engaged in some unique activities, for example, developing a reference panel for molecular diagnostic tests that developers can then run on their tests that would allow us to have a better understanding of the relative performance of tests out on the marketplace. We also work with NIH to establish a capability at the National Cancer Institute for the U.S. government to evaluate the test performance of antibody tests. This is the first time that the government has set up such a capability that allowed us to have greater confidence in tests out on the marketplace, better identify if we had poor performing tests as well. There have been a variety of lessons learned out of COVID. One of them goes back to the US government having a capability either themselves or through other laboratories to be able to assess tests, something that we think could be a capability in future pandemics, and in fact will leave some of the burdens on test developers to be required to validate their own tests for clinical performance. But some of the other big lessons learned go back to what I was talking about at the start of my presentation. First of all, for the FDA to have regulatory flexibility, not just during a pandemic, but outside of a pandemic, and not to change the US standard of reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness for medical devices, but to have greater flexibility on how that standard could be met. In addition, we saw the power of engagement, having the ability to work with developers in real time to answer their questions and problem solve. Unfortunately, we are not resourced to do that routinely outside of the public health emergency. In fact, even during the public health emergency, we put the resources to do it, but at great expense for our ability to review non-COVID technologies. Right now, during the discussions about reauthorization for the Medical Device User Fee Act, we have put on the table a proposal for having that capability to engage in such engagement outside of a public health emergency. And we'll see what happens. But the combination of those two together, of regulatory flexibility and engagement, were really the secret sauce that allowed us to authorize so many medical devices during COVID. Well, thank you very much for your attention. And now I'll turn the program over to Dr. Patrizia Cavazzoni, who will provide the perspective on CDER's response.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I just want to make sure that audio is working well, unless I hear otherwise. I'll assume it is. It's a pleasure to be here and provide the perspective from the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research on our approach to the public health emergency in supporting the rapid development of COVID therapeutics and the lessons learned from the past 18 months. So in order to deal with the new demand to accelerate the development of therapeutics, fairly early in the pandemic, we created a coronavirus treatment acceleration program, which entailed both CDER and CBER. And this program was set up to meet this urgent need for development of therapeutics in timelines that were unprecedented. And as part of this program, we used all available tools to engage with developers and also to exercise regulatory flexibility to the full extent that we could. And similar to what you have heard about from Jeff about the secret sauce, what were essential elements of this program were the early engagement and communication with drug developers, as well as regulatory flexibility. So some statistics about this program. So far, we have authorized 10 COVID-19 treatments. And keep in mind that these COVID-19 treatments are novel treatments. These are, for the most part, there are some that are, a couple of them that were repurposed, but otherwise these are novel treatments. So this gives you an idea of how fast the development played itself out. And we have really, we're really talking about developing drugs in a matter of months rather than years as the sort of normal development R&D cycle. There is one COVID-19 treatment that is currently approved, remdesivir, and we have hundreds of drugs that are still in the planning stage and are under review. So the principles for the CTAP program, were that we wanted to accelerate the development of drugs. However, what I want to make very clear is that our regulatory review and decision-making processes did not change and have not changed. And our standards within the context of the emergency use authorization authorities that we have and so on have remained the same. We give all research and developers our best advice, and we rely on science and data to make decisions. And as I mentioned, this is how we have been doing things before the public health emergency. I just want to provide some overview of the therapeutics that have been authorized. The first one was remdesivir, which is a nucleotide analog RNA polymerase inhibitor. It was authorized back in May 2020 and is actually now approved. And also, as you can see, the timelines, authorization took place in May, approval in October. These are very accelerated timelines, as they should be, given the fact that we were dealing with a public health emergency and tens of thousands of people dying every day at some point. The indication for Veklury is for treatment of COVID-19 for patients who require hospitalization. While we have approved the drug for adults, it remains under EUA for certain pediatric patients because the pediatric trials are still ongoing. Really the bulk and the workhorse of the COVID-19 therapeutics have been the monoclonal antibodies that have been targeted to the spike protein. The authorized use for these monoclonal antibodies, and we now have 3 drugs that are authorized, is for the treatment of mild to moderate COVID-19 early in the disease stage before hospitalization. And these drugs have shown a really substantial decrease of in the rate of hospitalization in patients with COVID-19. There are limitations for use in the use of monoclonal antibodies. They should not be used in patients who are hospitalized due to COVID-19 or require oxygen therapy or require increase in the baseline oxygen flow. The data in hospitalized patients has to date not shown any advantage in using these drugs later in the course of the disease, although some trials are ongoing, and there are some signals that in maybe a subset of patients, this is from the recovery trial in the UK, there may be some benefit, but still we have really not elucidated clearly a benefit in the more severe spectrum of the COVID-19 infections. We have 3 currently authorized monoclonal antibody therapies. They're on the slide, and these therapies are also at least 2 of these 3 are being distributed as part of the government direct engagement in the distribution of monoclonal antibodies throughout the country. The first that I want to sort of highlight is the combination of 2 antibodies that was approved in November 2020. This antibody is authorized for either a single IV infusion or subcutaneous injection, which clearly makes it easier to administer the antibody when the IV infusion is not feasible and would lead to treatment delay. Early as these antibodies were rolled out, we found that the sort of rate limiting step was actually the ability to for infusion centers to deploy resources to administer these drugs. And so obviously the advent of subcutaneous formulation can be an advantage. As with all of these monoclonal antibodies, based on the terms of the authorization, the drug should be administered as soon as possible after a positive viral test and within 10 days of symptom onset. The second authorized antibody is a combination of two antibodies, also targeting the spike protein, authorized in February 2021, to be administered as a single IV infusion. And as with the Regeneron combination, it should be administered early in the disease and within 10 days of symptom onset. And the latest antibody to be authorized in May 2021 is a single antibody, also targeting the spike receptor binding domain of SARS of the COVID-19. It's also authorized for IV infusion as the previous one, and should also has been authorized with under the same conditions for patients who are not hospitalized, have had a positive viral test, and are within 10 days of symptom onset. The issue of emerging variants is very relevant, not only to diagnostic, as you have heard, and also to vaccines, but also to therapeutics. And we have actually had some, we're already beginning to see some loss of utility of some of these antibodies against certain variants. And so we have to really take a dynamic approach to continuing to do surveillance of these monoclonal antibodies against the emerging variants to determine whether some of these variants may be associated with resistance to monoclonal antibodies. So as part of this, we have made recommendations to healthcare providers that they review antiviral resistance information in the section 15 of the fact sheet, which is the label, the equivalent of the label under emergency use authorizations, to really to review the details about specific variants and potential resistance to these variants for the individual monoclonal antibodies. And prescribers should also refer to CDC and information from state and local health authorities on reports of emerging viral variants and the the frequency of those variants in isolates. And very recently, in the recent in the past few weeks, we have issued some notifications to certain states about the emergence of certain variants, and recommended that certain monoclonal antibodies not be used in those states based on the antibodies' resistance to those variants. These are some examples of section 15 in the respective fact sheets. As you can see, they provide very detailed information on neutralization data for the specific antibody against the variants. This table is now a standardized table in all of the fact sheets of the 3 authorized monoclonal antibodies for COVID-19. Also, as a condition of the authorization, we require the sponsor to establish a process for monitoring genomic databases for emergence of global variants of COVID-19. And the sponsors are required to provide monthly reports to FDA summarizing any findings from these monitoring activities and any assessments that they may have conducted on the basis of this surveillance. And also, as a condition of the authorization, we reserve the right to require the sponsor to assess the activity of authorized monoclonal antibodies therapeutics against any global emerging variants. We also require the sponsor to provide it when requested samples of the authorized monoclonal antibody to U.S. government agencies for evaluation of activities against variants. And when appropriate, the letter of authorization will include conditions requiring the sponsor to submit remaining genomic sequencing information and virological data from clinical investigations by a specific date. So there are some very clear sort of requirement and expectations for surveillance by sponsors who have the responsibility to let us know whether they're seeing resistance emerging in some of these variants. As Jeff indicated in his presentation, there's also some CDER, some lessons learned for CDER from the public health emergency. And as you have heard from the CDRH presentation, the secret sauce is quite similar for therapeutics as it has been for devices. What we have learned that sponsors should engage early and often with our scientific staff to develop investigational programs for prevention or treatment of COVID-19. The sponsors should utilize manufacturing sites with demonstrated high quality standards and engage very early in discussions about CMC. Obviously, when we're trying to accelerate the availability of therapeutics, having to deal with facilities that we have never seen before, and some of them may be on the other side of the world, particularly with travel limitations that in some instances that have been limiting our ability to do on-site inspection, is really not the best approach. And so sponsors should really endeavor to utilize manufacturing sites that we know and are known to FDA and have a good track record when it comes to quality standards. The sponsors should also seek early FDA feedback on potential product labeling, including details such as carton container labeling and associated fact sheets. And last but not least, participating in master protocols provides significant efficiencies for both the agency and the sponsor, and may provide data from some endpoints that are collected in the same way across multiple products. And this makes our life easier because we can really more easily leverage all of the information across multiple programs that is submitted to us to really understand these class of drugs. Thank you for your attention, and I'm now turning over to Dr. Peter Marks, who will provide the perspective from CBER.
Thanks very much, Patrizia. I'm Peter Marks, Director of the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research. I'd like to give you a perspective on the pandemic response from our center. To do so, I'll speak about the emergency use authorized COVID-19 vaccines, which were a major part of the effort that we have put into the pandemic response over the past year and a half. To do so, I need to tell you a little bit about traditional vaccine development. Vaccine development is usually a highly de-risked process. Vaccines are not high-margin products, and so the investment that is placed into them by companies is usually done very carefully. And so normally vaccine development takes several years, and it proceeds in the orderly stages that one might expect through phase 1, then 2, then 3 of development. Additionally, manufacturing process development usually happens relatively late, and oftentimes at launch there are not large stocks of vaccine for distribution. The situation is very different, however, when you have a pandemic. Here you need a vaccine as quickly as possible, and the cost of having a stock of vaccine ready for distribution is small compared to the potential adverse effects of the pandemic on all other aspects of life. And so the way that vaccine development was accelerated during the current pandemic was that the phases of studies were condensed, eliminating dead space between phases 1, 2, and 2, 3. And commercial process development for manufacturing started relatively early on, and supplies of vaccine were made at risk so that if a vaccine was shown to be safe and effective, it could immediately be launched and distributed. That did mean that there was the possibility that you could have a large supply of vaccine that would have to be wasted if it was not shown to be safe and effective. But again, during a pandemic when people were losing their lives and there was tremendous disruption, this was felt to be a very reasonable trade-off to expedite development. Now, one of the other things that went into accelerating vaccine development was making these vaccines available through the most quick regulatory pathway that could make them available. And normally we make vaccines available as licensed vaccines under Section 351 of the Public Health Service Act. They're deemed to be safe, pure, and potent. And to make that determination, we consider evidence from adequate and well-controlled clinical trials, as well as manufacturing information and other information in the submissions. That is our normal process, but after the terrorist attacks of 9/11, Congress gave us the authority to make potentially life-saving medical products available in public health emergencies that were declared by the Secretary of Health and Human Services when there was not an approved and available alternative, because it was felt that during a chemical, biological, or radionuclear event, that if there was something in development that could potentially help people, even if it was not fully developed, it might merit use. And the standard that was put in place is that the product may be effective and that its known and potential benefits outweigh its known and potential risks. Now, that might be very reasonable if you are treating someone with an existing disease, something that happened because of one of these events. But in the current public health emergency, where you're going to be vaccinating literally tens upon tens of millions of healthy individuals, that standard might be considered by some to be a little bit low. And indeed, when we sat down at our center and thought about this, we felt that it was appropriate to set the bar somewhat higher. And in guidance that was published in October of 2020, we noted that we would authorize a COVID-19 vaccine for emergency use if there was clear and compelling efficacy from large, well-designed phase 3 clinical trials. We had talked about conducting those large phase 3 clinical trials in a June 2020 guidance. And as we also noted in that October guidance, we wanted the process to be as transparent as possible so that people would have trust in these vaccines, because we know that having a vaccine does not end a pandemic. Having people vaccinated does. And in order to also make sure that people knew that we were going to be doing our jobs to make sure that these vaccines continued to be safe, we noted that we would do enhanced post-deployment surveillance, looking for any adverse events that might arise after these vaccines were distributed and given. So let's just spend a couple minutes on what vaccine candidates are out there. We now have 3 emergency use authorized vaccines. The 2-dose mRNA regimens from Pfizer-BioNTech, given on days 1 and 21. Moderna, which is a 2-dose regimen given on days 1 and 28. There is the non-replicating viral vector, which is a human adenovirus 26 from Janssen. That is a 1-dose regimen. There is another non-replicating viral vector vaccine by AstraZeneca that is in development and is available outside of the United States, as well as 2 protein subunit vaccines, which are also in relatively advanced development. We would expect that those might have trial results submitted to the agency in the coming months. These are just a list of the more advanced vaccines, and 5 out of the 6 of these have been supported in some part by the United States government in terms of their development. So when we look a little bit more at the 3 emergency use authorized vaccines, they have some things in common. They were all done in large randomized controlled trials in terms of how they were studied. The average vaccine, when it reaches licensure, has had about 20,000 individuals treated with the vaccine, and you can see here that because of the large number of individuals enrolled in these randomized trials, these happen to be 1-to-1 randomization, those receiving vaccine to the placebo, somewhere between 15,000 and 21,700 individuals getting the vaccine. Additionally, these trials may have set a new bar for enrolling diverse populations because about 10% of the individuals were Black or African American, 20 to 25% were Latino, Latinx, Hispanic. There were some American Indian, Native Alaskans enrolled, and about a fifth to a quarter of the population was at least age 65. So a relatively diverse population mirroring the composition of our country. The important thing that came out of these trials is that all 3 of the vaccines prevent hospitalization and death from COVID-19. There is a small trade-off between the Janssen and Pfizer-BioNTech and Moderna vaccines in terms of the convenience of the Janssen vaccine, which is a 1-dose regimen, and the Pfizer-BioNTech and Moderna vaccines, which are 2-dose regimens, and have somewhat better efficacy in preventing milder forms of COVID-19. Again, major take-home message, though, is that all 3 of these vaccines prevent hospitalization and death from COVID-19. The safety of these vaccines was good. There are some short-term side effects that one needs to note, particularly after the 2nd dose of the Pfizer-BioNTech and Moderna vaccines. There can be pain at the site of injection, the feeling of fatigue or flu-like symptoms, particularly after the 2nd dose, starting about a day and lasting up to about 3 days afterwards. These symptoms resolve, and in general, this has not been a rate-limiting step for getting people vaccinated. Now, the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine has also been studied in adolescent individuals, ages 12 to 15. The original emergency use authorization was ages 16 and up, but the study that was done in 2,260 12 to 15-year-olds randomized 1-to-1 to vaccine or saline placebo. It compared the immune response in these individuals to the immune response in the 16 to 25-year-old age group, roughly an equal number of male and female participants in the study, and again, a diversity of individuals enrolled in the trial. So looking at the immune response in the 12 to 15-year-old age range compared to the 16 to 25-year age range, it was excellent. And in fact, if anything, the immune response in the 12 to 15-year old age range was better than in the 16 to 25-year-olds. Importantly, that translated into efficacy, and in 1,005 vaccinated 12 to 15-year-olds, there were no cases of COVID-19 observed, whereas there were 16 cases of COVID-19 in 978 12 to 15-year-olds who were given the saline placebo. The safety of the vaccine in the 12 to 15-year-old population was very similar to that in the 16 to 25-year-olds. And you can see that if anything, in certain cases, perhaps there were certain side effects a little lower or a little higher here or there, but on average, it looks very, very similar. And in fact, the side effect profile in the 16 to 25-year-olds is very similar to that in the 26 to 55-year-old age group. So a very similar safety profile in 12 and up to age 55. Above age 55, there tends to be somewhat less of the side effects noted here. Again, safety profile reasonable. We do tend to recommend to any individual after the second dose of the mRNA vaccines, particularly to note that they may experience the injection site pain or feeling tired or flu-like, that they may want to be prepared not to have a very full day scheduled the day after receiving the vaccine. Now, safety monitoring of these vaccines is obviously very important because we want to make sure that we understand that there are no adverse events of concern that are occurring and that we keep people well informed because obviously risk-benefit for vaccinating healthy people is a very important consideration. And so there is an overlapping set of safety monitoring systems in place right now, and they're monitored and administered by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the Food and Drug Administration. That includes passive safety monitoring through the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, which is a collaborative effort between CDC and FDA. We also are using active safety surveillance systems such as the CDC's Vaccine Safety Data Link and its clinical immunization safety assessment, as well as using FDA's collaboration with the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services using their Medicare database to look at vaccinations, and the Sentinel Best system, which is a claims-based and EHR-based database to look at about 15 safety outcomes of interest. Those are outcomes that have been seen with prior rollouts of vaccines to make sure that we're not seeing any adverse events of concern. So to date, there have been some safety signals, and one would expect that with any vaccine rollout. And in fact, if we had seen no adverse effects, we would think that there might be a problem with our safety surveillance systems. The first of these came very shortly after the launch of the Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna vaccines, and those were some severe allergic reactions. They occurred relatively shortly after the vaccination, and with implementation of a mitigation strategy, including asking individuals if they had allergic reactions to prior medications, and particularly vaccinations, and by having anaphylaxis kits in place and observing people who had had allergic reactions for 30 minutes, allergic reactions have been really reduced, and now that we believe that the risk of a severe allergic reaction is about 1 in 300,000 or so. After launch of the Janssen vaccine in the United States, we observed thrombosis thrombocytopenia syndrome similar to that which was observed in other parts of the world, particularly Europe, with the AstraZeneca vaccine. These are rare blood clots, mostly cerebral vein sinus thrombosis, associated with low blood platelet counts and occurring mainly in younger women, although some occurred in men and somewhat older individuals. This is a very rare effect that was seen in about 1 in a million individuals overall, although possibly as many as about 7 in a million in the 18 to 50 age range in women. And because of this, we added information to the product label about this. The overall discussion of this at the Advisory Committee of Immunization Practices of the CDC was that the benefit still greatly outweighs the risk with this vaccine across the entire age range, but we think it's important for people to be able to consider their options looking at the information. And the most recent of the safety signals to be discussed significantly was the myocarditis or pericarditis safety signal with the mRNA-based Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna vaccines, and generally has presented as chest pain following vaccination associated with laboratory electrocardiographic or imaging abnormalities, mainly in 16 to 30-year-old males. The strength of this association is still under investigation, and thankfully, though most of these cases have been very mild, they resolve on their own, and although some people have been hospitalized, they generally do not receive any specific treatment, get better, and go home. Again, relatively uncommon, and the benefits of vaccinating adolescents and young adults still greatly outweigh any adverse effects from myocarditis that have been seen. So what I've tried to tell you about today is that we have managed to shorten vaccine development timelines while still ensuring that there is a high degree of safety and efficacy associated with these. Our standards have not been cut, and actually no corners have been cut in developing these vaccines. And that's all been done in part in a very transparent way so that people will maintain confidence in these vaccines and will go get vaccinated. Again, just repeating something I said earlier, it's not having a vaccine that ends a pandemic. It's people getting vaccinated. So thank you for listening today. What I think, just to summarize overall, FDA's emergency response to COVID-19 has been multifaceted across devices, drugs, and biologics, and across different centers that have been involved. And this emergency use authorization authority that we have has allowed FDA to provide a timely response to protect public health, and the flexibility has been very helpful. So thanks again for listening today. Take care.
Thank you very much to our panelists for your wonderful remarks. Now we'll continue the plenary session with our roundtable discussion. So let me set the stage for this segment. Over the past year, many of you have sent in questions to us asking about a wide range of topics involving COVID-19. And in addition, during your registration for Ready, you sent us more feedback and more questions for us to consider. Thanks for all of your interactions with us, as this helps us to provide us the information that you need. We've taken all of the great questions and have come up with a few that we'll discuss today. I'll read out each question one at a time, and each panelist will have a chance to share their thoughts about the topic. And we'll continue with the next question. So let's get started with our very first question. Jeff, we'll start with you. And that question is this. Last year's plenary session addressed the topic of real-world evidence. As we've gathered a large volume of evidence and experience with various COVID-related therapeutics and diagnostics, do you see an opportunity to leverage real-world evidence in transitioning EUA-granted products to a more traditional pathway?
Well, thank you, Elias. Yes, we do see an opportunity to leverage real-world evidence in transitioning EUA-granted products to a more traditional pathway, and we've encouraged interested developers to come talk with us. We've also been working with the Reagan-Udall Foundation and others to further build out the infrastructure for generating real-world evidence about tests, to both be informative about COVID and also to use for tests for other indications outside the pandemic.
Thank you, Jeff. Patrizia will ask you the same question, leveraging real-world evidence for possible more traditional pathways. I think Patrizia, you're muted. So Peter will continue with you and ask you the same question.
I'm sorry, I thought I was going to be automatically muted, so I'm happy to answer the question. Can you hear me?
Of course.
Thank you. Yes. Yes, similar to what we have heard about devices, the pandemic has really led to a greater utilization of real-world evidence for therapeutics. We have leveraged real-world evidence for safety surveillance, and also for to study the natural history of the disease and utilization of drugs such as corticosteroids, for instance, and really understanding the evolving standard of care. So real-world evidence will continue to be important. Having said so, as we transition products from authorization to application, if the sponsor choose to apply for a BLA or an NDA, we will need to rely on the usual data that we require to make this decision, which is largely or mainly anchored on well-controlled clinical trials, and certainly real-world evidence can add some additional insights and potentially provide sort of a corollary information to the clinical trials.
Thank you, Patrizia. Peter, let's ask you the same question.
Yeah, thanks. No, I think Jeff and Patrizia really answered it quite well. We are very much engaged with using real-world evidence for both our efficacy and safety as we can in the future. Obviously, this is an area where we're really exploring in terms of efficacy, whereas we've been using real-world evidence for safety findings for quite some time, particularly around the area of vaccines. But we have in our center over the past years used real-world evidence to look at vaccine effectiveness, for instance, for high-dose influenza vaccine. And during the pandemic, we used it for convalescent plasma. So it's something that I suspect will continue to refine. And as we have better and better electronic health record systems, that should help facilitate its use.
All right, thank you very much. We'll go on to question 2. Has the way that FDA engages with industry changed permanently as a result of COVID? So Jeff, let's start with you again with this question.
All right. Well, the answer is yes. I mean, certainly in terms of using virtual platforms for interactions, whether that be for meetings or remote regulatory assessments conducted by our field inspectors, just to name a few. And we're currently implementing virtual workspaces for CDRH and our stakeholders as part of our digital transformation initiative, including to facilitate our working with industry on their pre-market submissions. I also hope it changes to allow for the kinds of engagement we had with developers during the pandemic, such as our pre-EUAs, where, as I mentioned, we answered questions and problem solved in real time. We just lacked the capacity to do this routinely. And that's why we put a proposal on the table for MDUFA 5 reauthorization called TAP, the Total Product Lifecycle Advisory Program, that would establish such a capability. And if it comes to pass, it would be the most formative advancement during the entire 20-year history of MDUFA. So we'll see.
Jeff, thank you very much. Time will tell. We'll see what happens with the future. Patrizia, same question for you. Has the way that FDA engages with industry changed permanently as a result of COVID?
Well, the degree of engagement that we have with industry and the timelines within which we engage with industry are clearly not sustainable in sort of as a go forward approach, given the amount of work that we have to do. Having said so, certainly the approach that we have taken with COVID is really reflective of what is the an essential approach for CDER to do its mission, which is to proactively engage with the scientific community, with the academic community, with sponsors, with patients group, and all of the stakeholders to advance the development of important therapeutics. What we saw during COVID is a more compressed approach to that when it comes to the timelines, but it is fundamentally based on what are fundamental pillars in our ability to fulfill our mission when it comes to therapeutics in general.
Thank you very much. All right, we'll get to question 3. Go back. I'm sorry, we'll stay with question 2 with Peter. Please, your thoughts on engaging industry as a result of COVID.
Yeah, I don't have much to add here. Just to say, just to add that I think that some of what we've been doing clearly has made a tremendous difference, and that to not try to incorporate it in terms of the communication and opening up lines of communication would be a missed opportunity.
Thank you, Peter. All right, we'll continue with question 3. And some of you have already touched upon this as well, so there's no need to repeat it, but anything else that you'd like to add? So Jeff, let's start with you. Is there anything that worked well at FDA during the pandemic that you'd like to sustain when the pandemic ends?
Yeah, well, let me put a new one on the table. Early on, guidances were being developed, cleared, and published, sometimes in days, oftentimes in weeks. And I'd like to see that happen routinely outside of the pandemic. I mean, that practice was a big win for public health.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm nodding my head to that one. Patrizia, the same question. Anything that worked well at FDA during the pandemic?
I would like to echo what we heard from Dr. Shuren about our approach to issuing guidance. I think that there's some good lessons learned there. For CDER, I would like to also add our the experience that we have accumulated with decentralized clinical trials. This is something that we see part of our tool belt going forward. And last but not least, the experience that we have gained in using alternative approaches to evaluation of manufacturing facilities as well as clinical trial sites and so on, which while we expect to be able to go back to on-site inspections when feasible and safe, we also want to retain some of what these learnings around alternative approaches as part of our ongoing tool belt.
Thank you, Patrizia. Peter, the question for you.
Just to echo, I think particularly the fact that we've managed to, in guidance, really propel that forward and find ways to do that in a streamlined fashion during the pandemic is something that, again, I don't want to fall back on the old ways of doing that. I think we really have made a difference, and particularly in our area where many of our products are quite cutting edge, being able to put out guidance in a very timely manner will hopefully mean that the guidance actually is more meaningful to sponsors.
Thank you, Peter. We'll try to get through a few more questions. I know we're running a little long, but this is a great session to have with our esteemed panel. Question 4 to Jeff. Some of you touched upon the mutations and variants of the virus. How do you foresee FDA's future response to these variants?
Well, as I mentioned in my presentation, I mean, we're going to continue to monitor publicly available databases for new mutations to assess whether they are alone or in combination with other mutations could adversely impact the performance of individual tests. And then if they might, contact the developer, have them perform additional studies to look into it. One exciting development is that we and NIH, working with some of their RADx partners, have created a capability to conduct our own studies, particularly of antigen tests for specific variants. And that we anticipate continuing moving forward as well.
Thank you, Jeff. Patrizia, the same question for you. The impact of mutations of the virus?
So for therapeutics, as you saw from my presentation, we also recognize the critical importance of surveillance of variants against the effectiveness of antivirals. One of the things that we have done for drugs is that we are requiring manufacturers to do surveillance as part of the conditions of the authorizations and to report back to us if we find if there is new information that could indicate that the antiviral is no longer has lost utility against certain variants. And so obviously we all rely on the same databases, but we see it as a responsibility of the manufacturers as a condition for the authorization to do this surveillance.
Thank you, Patrizia. Peter, let's send the same question to you as well.
Yeah, so for us, it will be keeping up with a variety of things, but particularly keeping up with the vaccines and whether we'll be able to keep with a given vaccine or need to change strains of the SARS coronavirus 2 that's used in the composition of the vaccine. So we'll be keeping a close eye on things and working with manufacturers. I suspect this is going to keep us busy in the coming years until this is under control, with the constant need to have surveillance and potentially update the vaccine compositions.
Thank you, Peter. Next up, probably the number one question that's been coming to our division at DICE. So we'll send this to you, Jeff. When do you anticipate ending the EUA pathway for the COVID pandemic? Will there be a transition period?
Well, I think for most products we have authorized, the EUA pathway won't be ending anytime soon, and there will be ample transition period, which we plan to describe in a guidance that would be available for public comment before finalizing. I mean, the exception is where we authorize products that we otherwise would not have on the U.S. marketplace, but for the need to address shortages. As I think you recently saw in the case of respirators that I talked about, where we revoked the EUAs for non-NIOSH approved respirators, as well as decontamination systems, because we now have ample supply of NIOSH approved products. That said, we encourage developers with EUAs to not wait to gather the necessary data and submit an application if they want full marketing authorization.
Thank you, Jeff. Patrizia, the same question for you. Actually, I think it looks like Patrizia had to step away. So Peter, will continue with you with this question.
No, thanks very much. So yeah, no, we will probably have at some point there will be some relatively complicated looking transition period for the vaccines, and that will probably be because we will have various vaccines that will be transitioning into biologics license applications, but it's possible that there may be indications, for instance, in pediatrics, that might be still in the emergency use category. That's something where I can't say we have all finalized yet, because we're trying to figure out what will make the most sense moving forward. So we'll be working on this. And ideally, the idea here is to minimize anything that could create confusion or reduce the trust in the products that we're dealing with, primarily vaccines right now.
Thank you, Peter. All right, we have time. I know we're running long on this session. We'll go to our last question, question 7 for Jeff. So in 5 words or less, how would you describe 2020?
Never again.
Awesome. Peter, to you?
Unmitigated.
Wow, 2 words or less. That's fantastic. All right. So with that, Peter, you get the final word for our ready plenary session. To our esteemed panelists, Dr. Cavazzoni of CDER, Dr. Shuren of CDRH, and Dr. Peter Marks of CBER, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to spend this time with us. You've been inspirational leaders in guiding the FDA through this public health emergency. And thank you for sharing the important work that we've done so far in the fight against COVID. Thanks to our global audience for joining us. I hope you enjoyed learning something from our FDA leadership on this very important topic. So this will conclude our plenary session. We'll take a short